This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name, community in which you now reside.
My name is Bob Lieber, and I now live in South Dennis on Cape Cod.
Um, what lead what led you to living on Cape Cod?
I'm a doctor, a physician, surgeon, and I came to Cape Cod in 1977 because they needed the type of doctor that I am.
And what is that?
I'm a neurosurgeon.
Where did you grow up?
My father was an Army officer, so I grew up all over the United States, uh, 11 different states and 11 different schools growing up.
Was anyone else in your family in the military?
My father,
Was it just him?
um, I'm an only child, so that I have no brothers and sisters, and my father was a career Army officer, which means he spent 35 years in the Army.
Growing up, what did you plan on doing as a career?
Growing up, I don't think I had any idea what I was going to do. Like most young people, um, I didn't really decide about going to medical school until later in college.
Did you enjoy your schooling or any sports?
Um, I enjoyed some of my school, not all of my school, and you can imagine how difficult it would be to switch schools in the middle of the year, all new friends, all new problems. Uh, so school was a little difficult. Um, I enjoyed the sports. I wasn't any good, but I enjoyed it, particularly basketball.
Growing up, what wars were going on, and did they impact your community or your family?
What was what growing up?
What wars were going on?
Oh, way back when I was in school, it would be the Korean War, uh, which we didn't really know much about, but we knew it was going on. Um, my father was not involved in that war. He stayed in this country.
Were you drafted into the military or did you volunteer?
Um, I wasn't drafted. I volunteered in that I got a military scholarship to medical school. In other words, the military paid my way through medical school, which was very good because it's an expensive school.
Mm.
So from that point on, I was in the military.
Did you have any friends who joined with you?
Um, no friends that joined with me. Obviously, I had many friends later on when I was fully in the military.
How did you decide that you wanted to be in the medical corps?
My father was not only in the military, but a military doctor. So I was always around doctors and always around hospitals and things like that. And it seemed like um, something that perhaps I would be interested in. Um, I hoped that I would do well enough in school that I could get into a medical school.
Where was your training?
My doctor training was at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and then later my surgical training was at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. I spent perhaps 7 years at Walter Reed learning to be a neurosurgeon.
How did you decide that you wanted to be a neurosurgeon?
You're exposed to all different types of medicine in medical school, and I thought that was the most interesting and fascinating part of medicine.
Was the training difficult, and what was involved in it, and how long was it?
The training for neurosurgery after you get out of 4 years of medical school was very difficult, but it was something that you really, really loved. So you didn't mind 12, 13, 14 hours a day working. You didn't mind middle of the night. You didn't mind anything. It was total 100% work.
So did you go to an extra school after that to be a neurosurgeon?
No, that was the neurosurgical part of my training. After medical school, neurosurgery training lasts anywhere from 5 to 7 years. So you don't even get out of school until you're 31, 32 years old.
Did the military send you to school before joining the military?
They sent me to school, and I became part of the military at that point. It's like a scholarship. They pick you and you say, yes, I would like to do this, and from that point on, you're in the military.
Can you describe your first impressions of your base overseas?
My first base overseas, my first base overseas was in Vietnam. After I had finished my neurosurgery training and was a neurosurgeon, very shortly thereafter, they sent me to Vietnam.
Can you describe the settings and how is it different from America?
I think you can probably imagine how different it would be from America to be in an Asian country that was somewhat primitive at that stage of development and in the middle of a war. It was frightening and difficult and certainly a new experience.
What was your role, and what was, can you describe a typical day?
My role there was as the neurosurgeon for the war, and I was in charge of a hospital that was primarily a neurosurgical hospital. They brought, when possible, all of the individuals that were injured in the head or the spine to this hospital, and we took care of them there, both Americans and even the enemy soldiers that were wounded ended up at our hospital.
So was there more than one neurosurgeon?
Yes. I had 3 other neurosurgeons working with me at this hospital. 2 of them were incompletely trained neurosurgeons. In other words, they were sent there before they had finished their entire training, but they were still very useful and competent. So altogether there were 4.
So you were like the head doctor there, right?
Yes.
Did you tutor them at all?
I'm sorry?
Did you tutor them at all and teach them?
Not to a great extent, because they were far enough along in their training that the things we had to take care of in Vietnam were more fundamental things that they already knew exactly how to take care of.
What were some conflicts and how did you resolve them?
Conflicts,
I don't know. If you had any problems over there, like,
oh, there were lots of problems. Yeah, the problems being you didn't really have up-to-date, sophisticated equipment like you had back in this country. Things were considerably more primitive. The conditions in a wartime situation, you're always worried about enemy encounters, and every once in a while they're actually shooting at you, and shooting rockets into your hospital. So that kind of disturbs the normal everyday flow. And just things like the weather, hot and humid and raining and miserable. It's not a whole lot of fun for an American type person who's never lived in that environment.
are there any huge storms that you remember?
Storms. They have a thing called a monsoon season in Vietnam, which means it rains as hard as you could possibly imagine for hours and hours and hours. And so that the ground is a complete mud bath, like a swimming pool of mud. And but you know it's coming, and so you just have to deal with it.
Was it hard to manage the hospital with all the storms? And
The storms were not as bad as the constant danger of what we call the enemy shooting rockets, explosives into your hospital. And we had sandbags all around and places where we could get behind, but the patients, the ones that were wounded and everything, were not particularly mobile, so we had to carry them and hide them behind sandbags and that sort of thing.
can you describe the procedure you would do if you heard that you were being attacked?
Well, what we did as doctors and people that worked in the hospital and as patients is basically hide. We weren't in charge of fighting. We did our doctor, nurse work, and when the enemy attacks your hospital, you basically hope that the troops that are supposed to be protecting you do their job, and you just hide and take care of the patients.
So it was your job to sort of hide the patients and then hide yourselves?
That's
in that?
right.
Did you have any armed soldiers there, with you?
We were in the middle of a large collection of infantry soldiers, so that one of their functions was to protect us. And so that's what we hoped that they would do. We weren't skilled in fighting. We were skilled in doing medical work, so we just hoped that they did their job.
How did your experiences change your perspective?
Well, I think what you learn being exposed to a war of any kind is that war is a very bad thing, and that you should always realize that it's a last resort. It's never a good thing, and it should be avoided if at all possible. There are no good wars.
Um, if you ever broke the rules, can you like describe the punishments that?
The military has very strict codes and very strict um, rules, and you break the rules in the military, it's like in normal everyday life. You can end up going to prison, you can end up doing all kinds of bad things to yourself. So you have to, even though you may not agree with some of the rules, you have to follow them. There aren't many excuses for not doing it the right way.
Can you describe the hospital that you were in?
The hospital, on television, many times people are familiar with a show called MASH, which was the Korean War. Well, this was similar. Our hospital were tents surrounded by sandbags, and we didn't have fancy things like air conditioning, and it was very primitive.
Was it like a building or a tent? Or
It's
can you
like
describe?
a great big tent. The tent's held up by metal staging, so it's a bit more stable than the kind of tent you go camping in. But there would be about 30 to 50 beds in one tent, and we'd have several of these tents lined up, and then build walls on the side with sandbags to protect us.
Where would you hide the patients if you were in a tent?
If the patients couldn't get out of bed, if they weren't able to walk or at least be carried, we just put them down next to the sandbags on the ground and hope for the best. Those that could walk or we could move, we put them in separate areas where the sandbags were all inclusive, like over the top, and with a little bit better protection.
What was the scariest attack that you ever endured?
I think the scariest one was a thing that they called the Tet Offensive, which was around Christmas time of the first year I was there, when the Viet Cong attacked this area where we were, and you could watch the rockets going over the top of the hospital, and you didn't know, you had no way of knowing whether you were winning or losing or what was happening, and you were just hoping that the infantry was doing their job.
Did you have any Army trucks with you?
Any Army what?
Trucks?
Trucks. All of the transportation in that part of the country was by helicopter. The patients were brought to us by helicopter, and if we had to go anywhere away from the hospital, it was also by helicopter. There was no normal transportation by cars or trucks like we have in this country. It was, the road system was too primitive and dangerous.
Can you describe like those helicopter rides if you ever were attacked while you were in one or anything?
The helicopters were good, but they were also easy targets for the enemy on the ground, because they could shoot at them as they went by, and they weren't very high up in the air. So they were pretty normal targets. The few times that I was in a helicopter, we did get it ground fire once, and it was frightening.
Can you describe that?
Well, I think you can imagine how you'd feel if you're sitting in a helicopter that's going comparatively slow compared to normal airplane like, and bullets are going through the side of the helicopter that you're sitting in. Yes, it was exciting and scary.
What were the thoughts going through your head as you were going to Vietnam?
Nobody that I knew would say that they were happy they were going or they wanted to go, or but you're in the Army and that's where they want you to go, and you just go and try to be as brave and understanding as you possibly can be.
Do you have any funny stories from your time?
There weren't a lot of funny stories. There were a lot of sad stories, but there are, even in a war, there are things that can be funny. I was remembering that in almost all the food that you had in Vietnam, there were bugs. Bugs were a normal part of everyday life. They were there, and they were there before you got there. So you could tell how long somebody had been in Vietnam by how they reacted to the bugs in the food. If somebody just got there 2 or 3 weeks ago, they would say, "Oh my gosh, look at these bugs in the food. I'm not going to eat this." If they'd been there 2 or 3 months, they'd say, "Well, I'll take the big ones out and the heck with it. I'm going to eat it anyway." And then if you'd been over there 6 months or so, you'd say, "I don't see any bugs."
Can you describe an everyday meal?
An everyday meal, all the people, doctors, nurses, people that worked in the hospital, and the patients that are able to walk would all eat in a thing called a mess hall, which is a great big room that serves 3 meals a day. The food was actually pretty good if you don't mind bugs. Nothing you can do about bugs because they are just everywhere, and that's that. But you learn that it's just a little extra protein.
What was your favorite meal?
I guess breakfast was my favorite meal. It was dependable, and if you could get by on eggs and toast, it was pretty simple and it was reasonably good.
How did they cook the food?
The Army, even though it might be primitive, the Army has very skilled, competent cooks. And they do a remarkable job sometimes in very primitive surroundings. And then the Army also has what they call MREs, meals ready to eat, which are a little cardboard box that has dehydrated things like chicken a la king, and all they do is heat it up and hand it to you. And it was livable.
Was the mess hall in the hospital?
Yes. They had their own separate tent and all the necessary things to cook with, and that was their 24-hour-a-day job. The cooks, they cooked all the meals. They stayed there. That was their work.
What would you do if you got attacked while you were in the mess hall and your patients were alone?
If you got attacked at the mess hall, that would mean that they had also attacked the hospital and gotten through the surrounding infantry, and you would be in big trouble.
So there were no soldiers in the mess hall.
No.
How did they bring the food to the base?
They brought the food to the base by helicopter, large transport helicopters that would fly in and bring everything that we needed, food, medicine, even people. There was no ground transportation that was safe, and so the helicopter was used for everything.
What was the difference between those helicopters and the ones that you were brought on?
The large helicopters they used for transporting big material, the Chinook helicopters, quite large with double rotors. Sometimes you see, even on the Cape, the large Coast Guard helicopters, but they're about half the size of the ones that they use for supply.
What kind of medicine did you often use?
Medicines. We had essentially all of the medicines that you'd find in a hospital in this country. And it was always up to date. We had anything that we would need was supplied for us, even blood transfusions.
Was it the same quality medicine as here in the States?
Yes, yeah.
Did you develop any brothers in arms or close friendships?
Yes, I certainly did. And, the other doctors that I lived with, we lived essentially in the same bedroom, if you want to call it that, the same tent. We were with each other 24 hours a day. We ate together, we worked together. It would be hard not to develop friendships in a situation like that.
How did you keep the medicine? Like, did you keep it cold or?
We kept it in the same way that you keep it in this country. There was enough refrigeration that you could keep the blood and other fragile medicines safe. Those things were well taken care of.
Was there electricity?
Oh yes, we had our own generators, so our own power plant. So we generated the entire electrical system for the hospital. We even had pumps for our own water system.
Did you have any power outages?
They were frequent because all of the wiring was cables run on the ground from one tent to another, and things were constantly going wrong with that, but they were simple things that could be easily taken care of by our clever electricians splicing things together.
If you had to do a surgery while there was a power outages, how would you do that?
The power outages were always so short that they could 2 or 3 minutes they would have a secondary supply of power, and it was never a long outage. So we managed.
How long were you overseas?
I was overseas a year and a half.
What kind of surgeries did you do?
The majority of things that the neurosurgeons saw and took care of in Vietnam were fragment wounds of the head. When bullets, bombs, mortars explode, fragments of metal will frequently hit people and hit them in the head. And if it penetrates the skull, then you certainly have to do something about it. Have to remove it and take care of the wound and things like that.
Do you have any advice for young people today?
Advice about what? Avoid war. I think young people know, are smart enough to know nowadays that war is not a glorious adventure. War is a very, very dangerous and bad thing. And that every attempt should be made to resolve differences by a means other than war. There's nothing wonderful about a war experience.
Well, thank you very much for coming and letting us interview you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes.
No, that was
Thank you.
fast.
Yeah.